Welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast. I'm your host, Durval Barzi. And today I'm joined by Christianne Zakour. Hi, Christianne.
Hi, Durval.
Christianne Zakour is a specialist in loss and damage and climate peace and security with extensive experience campaigning on behalf of small island developing states with a grassroots focus. She's also a writer on environmental matters. Christianne is an ambassador for the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, Caribbean representative for the Loss and Damage Youth Grantmaking Council, a project assistant with the Institute for Small Islands, and Deputy Caribbean Front Coordinator for World's Youth for Climate Justice. Christianne holds an MSc in Biodiversity, Conservation, and Sustainable Development from the University of the West Indies. So we're here to talk about climate loss and damage. The sharp rise in carbon emissions in the Earth's atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution has led to global warming and rapid changes in the atmosphere, oceans, and on land. The impact of rising average global temperature includes rising sea levels, ocean acidification, and extreme weather events. These impacts negatively affect people, property, natural ecosystems, and man-made infrastructure. A clear example of this is the increased occurrences of heat waves, which endanger vulnerable members of the population, such as the elderly and pregnant women, and adversely affect agricultural yield and worker productivity. And coastal erosion leads to forced migration and the loss of livelihoods. So this is the reality for many Caribbean territories facing the economic and non-economic losses due to climate change. So, Christianne, in the context of climate change, how would you define loss and damage?
So loss and damage has never really been defined by the place where it's used the most. That's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It hasn't really been defined by them, but we have a lot of different definitions by policymakers, by think tanks, and they all kind of say the same thing. It looks at the consequences of climate change that people experience, that communities experience, that goes beyond what they can adapt to normally. That could be things like sea level rise, ocean acidification, saltwater intrusion in our aquifers, which is groundwater, and even a storm that is so bad that it causes catastrophic damage. All of that falls under loss and damage. I see it as being like the other side. Loss and damage and climate justice are two sides of the same coin, because they kind of fundamentally look at the same thing. The people who are experiencing loss and damage the most have done the least to contribute to the causes. And that would be small island developing states, least developed countries. In practice, climate justice is more like a legal and philosophical concept, whereas loss and damage looks at the quantifiable economic and non-economic losses.
The fact that climate justice and loss and damage are two sides to the same coin, and basically we're advocating for the same thing, to recognize the vulnerable position that we have found ourselves in through no fault of ours, and also calling the global community to be accountable and responsible to address this current crisis. If you've been operating in this climate change space for any length of time, you are familiar with, the key responses to climate change. One being mitigation, that is changing our energy systems to reduce carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. And adaptation, using man-made infrastructure and enhancing natural ecosystems to withstand the changes that are already happening. And there's also a greater emphasis on climate resilience and, as you mentioned, climate justice. And added to these important elements, we've been hearing more and more about loss and damage. And this issue of climate loss and damage has been on the negotiating table for some time. It was only in 2022 that climate negotiators agreed that a loss and damage fund should be established. So how does the concept of loss and damage challenge the traditional approaches to climate action?
From the beginning, loss and damage has always been championed by countries that are hardest hit. I think it was Vanuatu, who is a Pacific island. They first introduced it in the early 90s to propose an international insurance pool to compensate small islands, the impacts of sea level rise. And from there, it just kept snowballing to encompass all of these different impacts that we see today. If you follow any climate negotiations, you will notice it is the small islands, the Alliance of Small Island States, they are raising the most noise. And they're saying the most daring statements. It's all true. But they're the only ones in the room saying that. Which is really quite sad when you think about it. Because we should all be on the same boat, right?
Yeah.
Looking broadly, loss and damage is actually closely tied to adaptation. So it's not completely removed from mitigation and adaptation. It's tied to adaptation, which looks at managing impacts, whereas loss and damage is responding to the impacts. And this kind of approach was formalized in the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage.
So essentially, it's an extension of the existing climate responses.
Yes, but with an element of justice.
Right. And we know that
loss and damage is saying these things are happening to us and we did nothing to deserve it.
Because as you mentioned, loss and damage comes into play when we're talking about impacts that are beyond our capacity to respond to. We're talking about small island developing states that are already heavily burdened with that and have these very fragile ecosystems and just happen to be located within the hurricane belt. Yet still, it seems to be a struggle to get persons to acknowledge this and to take accountability for their contributions and not just be concerned about the impacts that are unfolding within their boundary lines. I think it's unfortunate that only when climate impacts started really unfolding in the developed world, such as the wildfires that we've seen in California and the storms in Houston and, those different extreme events, is when I think the reality of climate change really hits home for them. But the sad thing is that is something that the region, countries in the region, Dominica, St. Lucia, Jamaica, have been experiencing over the past number of years,
Yeah.
So I know, Christianne, that you are deeply involved in this space. As you said, it has been around, but I don't think a lot of attention was being placed on it as it is being placed now. And it's good that we're getting increased awareness and increased attention being placed on loss and damage, what it is and what it can do for our region and why it's important for us to continue lobbying for it to be implemented or enforced. How are policymakers and international organizations addressing the issue of loss and damage associated with climate change? And are they doing enough?
On the international policy level, I am not positive that enough is being done, considering it took 28 years to set up the Loss and Damage Fund and 27 years for it to even be addressed. The outlook is a little bleak. On country level, I would say that it seems to be more reactive than proactive. It's harder to clean up a wildfire if you have people living in the line of fire, if you don't have your water resources, if you haven't been conducting regular fire practices. Because in truth and fact, if we look at California specifically, a lot of those forests there have evolved to have consistent small fires, and fires are very beneficial for the environment. But if you criminalize fires completely and you don't have a forest management system to involve small fires, what happens is that all that little dead brush and small shrubs, everything dries up. When there is a fire, it's going to be so much more catastrophic because you didn't take the time to manage and use the system that the forest has had for thousands of years before humans. In the Caribbean, we have a safety net, at least, which is the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. It's a parametric insurance facility, which basically when there's a disaster, the countries who have paid in their money and they've applied for these specific plans, they will get money in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So when we had the 2018 floods here in Trinidad, we qualified for payouts of 10 million TTD, and most of that went to fixing the Solomon Hocho Highway, which experienced some heavy damages. So we have that safety net, and that's fantastic. But I feel like not enough is being done to prepare the population for any other disasters. Holistically, addressing loss and damage needs to be reflective of the full scope of impacts, which are economic, non-economic, slow onset like sea level rise, rapid events like a hurricane. And these have impacts on communities, whole countries, and it all needs to be linked to the SDGs and reducing poverty, really. There was Hurricane Dorian in 2019. There was Maria and Irma in 2017. When those happened, I said those names were going to be retired, and they were retired because they were just so dramatic. I specifically remember with Maria, it experienced, I think the term is super intensification, I'm not sure, but it jumped categories in a matter of like hours. That's not normal. You can go back in history. There was Ivan in 2004. If you talk to older Grenadians now, they have trouble telling you about their experiences because it was so traumatic on the ground. There's also, in terms of impacts, there's also sea level rise. Can't remember which country this was. Might have been Trinidad, I'm not sure. But there was a coastal cemetery that was being uncovered because of the constant wave action and the way that the sea was reclaiming the land, that the bones of people who had been buried there, they were becoming exposed.
Wow.
How exactly do you prepare for that? So loss and damage takes forms that are not just economic. Then you can look further. There's coral bleaching. Every year we see alerts for coral bleaching, and there's not really much that can be done because the oceans are warming. You can't prepare for that on a policy scale. You can only hope that the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement is met. Once you lose coral reefs, there's no going back. They take millions of years to form. They're thriving ecosystems, they're fisheries, they're coastal protection. They filter water coming off the land. They have so many benefits, and they're so delicate at the same time. I was ranting there.
No, that's important. It's important to bring it home.
We in the Caribbean are famously very lackadaisical. We like to be laid back. We don't react until there's a thing to be reacted to. But in 2022, there was a tropical storm that was supposed to hit. And it was bad enough that KFC closed early. If KFC closes, you know something's going down. People left their jobs early, and they went to the hardware, they went to the grocery, and there was buying everywhere. And it seemed like Trinis were actually going to be prepared for this thing. Municipal corporations have the responsibility to provide sandbags. They ran out of bags, but they still had sand. So they were saying, if you have bags, come and get your sandbags. And all of that, and at 10 o'clock that night, the storm went north. So all of that preparation was for nothing. Like, I saw memes that the storm hit the And in Trinidad and Tobago. It actually had some impacts in Tobago and Grenada, but it didn't touch Trinidad. So that was one of the few times I've ever seen Trinis really step up to the occasion. It should have been done from weeks before that. You should not be buying your supplies the day of a storm. But I think that there is a cultural shift happening.
We do need a culture shift. We can speak for Trinidad and Tobago because that's where we live. And we have been fortunate to be spared any direct impact from a hurricane in the past years. But who is to say that that will always be the case, with the weather systems being so, I want to say, erratic,
So the general trend is that Trinidad, at least, we will have less precipitation, but the storms that occur will be much harsher. So 2018, it wasn't a tropical storm, it wasn't a hurricane. I think it was a tropical wave or a storm, but it wasn't a hurricane. And look at the chaos that caused.
And we don't have to look too far to see what our neighbors have experienced, Barbados, sure, going up the islands. We have real stories of the devastating impact of these weather events. So we definitely need to be more proactive at all levels. We talk a lot on this podcast about policies. We also talk about solutions, but we also try to highlight individual and collective action that can be taken, grassroots interventions, creating a level of awareness about climate change, about climate resilience, and how we can be more prepared, the changes that we can actually make as individuals, as households, and as communities. Even now, as we get ready to head into the hurricane season, it's a good time to remind ourselves to take the necessary steps to be prepared, to reinforce whatever needs to be reinforced, have our emergency supplies on hand, have our emergency contacts, have an evacuation plan, because this is our reality. So even while we advocate for stronger action at the international, regional, and national level, as individuals who are aware and are informed about what is happening in our environment, we also have a responsibility to boost our resilience where we can.
I would encourage listeners to take a first aid course. Join your local CERT if it exists. That is the Community Emergency Response Team. I know for sure there's one in Trinidad. I'm one of the members. It's a title I hold very proudly. Educate yourself on how to make a go bag for your family. And do the things like look at your escape routes, look at shelters in your area. The go bag specifically will comprise things like having non-perishable food, having an appropriate amount of water, having your medications, having comfort foods and things for your kids to snack on. If you have pets, I have 9 cats and a dog, and it would break my heart if I lost them in a natural disaster. Have your carriers and your leashes ready and have somewhere to put them. It's scary to be thinking of what could happen, but if you equip yourself with the knowledge, it becomes a lot easier to manage. Knowledge is power.
It absolutely is. So, Christianne, you mentioned that it took 28 years to set up the Loss and Damage Fund. And I know at the last COP, there was some action around operationalizing the Loss and Damage Fund. You attended both COP 28 and 27. So could you share a bit about your experience at COP and the progress that has been made between those two COPs around loss and damage?
So for starters, if you don't like crowds, don't go to a COP because it's thousands of people. You will get lost. That was the first thing that hit me in both of my years. It's a lot of people and they're all descending onto this one place. So it's almost like a microcosm of the who's who. When you go to a COP, you're rubbing shoulders with members of parliaments, prime ministers and presidents, famous activists. Unfortunately, the negotiation rooms are very small. You often have to juggle access badges between people in order to go inside. If you have a party badge, you don't have that problem. I had a great time meeting people, collecting business cards, handing out my own, because there's so many different people there doing different things, but all for the same purpose. COP27 was special for loss and damage because that was the first year that it was on the agenda. As in, for 26 years prior to that, it was not on the agenda. That was a start, but then it took the whole 2 weeks plus days added on for them to agree that there needed to be a fund. It almost looked like a stalemate. When they had to prolong the negotiations beyond the scheduled end, it looked like we were going to leave without a fund. And then at the last moment, I don't know who pulled what strings, but we had the fund. We didn't have any details about the fund, but we had the fund. A year passed, a transitional committee was set up to research and come up with recommendations for the COP28 presidency. And on the first day of COP28, I think it was in the opening speech, the opening plenary, the COP28 president agreed to the recommendations and he banged his gavel, and now we have a fund that's operationalized. There's still a lot of work to do. There are some pledges made, totaling, I think it was 700 million US, which, if you ask me, is kind of a joke. When a storm can cause hundreds of millions, if not billions, in damages, but you know what? It's a start. We'll take it. There was also some controversy among the developing countries who do not like that the World Bank is the current fiduciary host for the next, I think it's 5 years or so, because the World Bank doesn't exactly have the best track record when it comes to things like accountability and human rights. I'm not entirely educated on who the alternative could be, but for now, I will say that not everybody is happy with the World Bank. And from there, COP29, the world is our oyster, right?
There are mixed feelings about COP and its effectiveness on whether or not the agreements there translate into concrete action and trickles down. But we can agree that it is an important event or activity that takes place when it comes
It
to...
is very important. But I will say that the UNFCCC COP might be too big for its own good. There's too many eyes on it. There's too many people going. And for that reason, nothing much is going to get done every year. The UNFCCC COP is the only one I've gone to. I would like to change that once funding becomes available. But I will always remember a colleague of mine saying, this was sometime last year, she said that she went to COP27 and then she went to Montreal for the COP for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And because there were so many less people, they were able to pass through the 30 by 30 agreement to have 30% of protected land by 2030. That's phenomenal. And that happened in one sitting of the COP. You're not going to find that kind of progress in the UNFCCC COP because there's so many people and so many eyes and journalists watching. Now, you'll find a lot of delegates for developed countries. They know what should be done, but they are acting in the interests of their countries that they represent. And unfortunately, the interests of those countries do not always align with what should be done. Let's be honest.
Yeah, and for listeners who might be wondering, UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And also there are different COPs, Conference of the Parties for different issues, climate change being one of them. But there's also, as Christianne mentioned, one for biodiversity, and there's one upcoming for Escazú.
Yes, so every treaty, every multilateral environmental treaty, usually has a COP. So the Escazú Agreement, which was ratified in 2021, I think is the third COP coming up now. And there's also the Rotterdam, Basel, and Stockholm Conventions on pollutants. Those take place at the same time in Switzerland. I think it's only the UNFCCC that changes locations like that. But yes, most treaties have a COP assigned to them, and they basically meet every year to kind of review the treaty and decide how best to tackle the issues associated with those treaty for the next year.
So has the climate COP lost its way? Don't answer that. That's another podcast episode. So this podcast has a wide range of listeners, and I want to drill down a bit in terms of what does a loss and damage fund mean for us as Caribbean people, and what impact can that have on my experience of climate change?
So the Caribbean is one of the world's most debt-riddled regions, because when your GDP is a particular number and a single storm can cause damages of that number, it's very hard to bounce back. In fact, the Caribbean has had, I would say, bad relations with some international banks like the IMF. I mean, it's bad enough when I was learning about it in Caribbean studies, and I remember learning about things like Belize borrowed, I think it was $1 billion, and they had to pay back $2 billion because they took so long that they accrued another $1 billion in interest. That's not sustainable. So the Caribbean has a problem with debt. And that was something that Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, she was trying to tackle with her Bridgetown initiative, which was then taken up by the Paris Finance Forum last year. I'm not sure where that's gone at this point, but she is really looking at trying to improve debt, especially where it concerns climate impacts. Now, that's only one part of the whole puzzle. Having a fund for loss and damage we're not too sure what a loss and damage fund is going to look like. but it would mean that in the event of a disaster that causes loss and damage, we would be able to access money to at least adapt to what's going on. And maybe not be resilient in the future, because resilience is a whole other ballgame. But at least we could return to a semblance of normality with that money that's being provided. There is an elephant in the room. In that 700 million, the initial pledges is not nearly enough, but we'll work from there.
I must say that, Christianne, I consider you to be a pioneer in this area. There's a lot of attention around the other aspects or the other layers of climate action. And I'm speaking locally and also a bit regionally, but more so locally. There's a lot of activity around climate mitigation, climate action. But I think we're just starting to pay more attention to loss and damage. By pay attention, I mean to understand it more and how it connects with all the other dimension of climate action. The truth is that the climate crisis is so complex and oftentimes overwhelming. We have to stay hopeful. We have to believe that the actions that we take individually and collectively will make a difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, Christianne, looking ahead, what do you see as some of the key challenges and opportunities for addressing loss and damage and climate action in general on a global and regional scale?
I think the biggest challenges right now, one of them is debt, which I mentioned already. The other thing is that it doesn't matter how we talk and who does what and who say what at this conference, because you know what? Climate impacts are being felt now. And unfortunately, the reality of that doesn't seem to translate to those living in developed countries. I thought something different would have happened when, I think it was in 2022, somewhere in Europe had horrible floods. And I will not celebrate that people were damaged. I would say damaged by that, because some of the videos I saw of streets being washed out and bridges falling, that's not good. Nobody should ever have to experience that. But I thought that since it was now being experienced by people living in an insulated country, I thought maybe something different would happen, but no. So we in the small islands are the canary in the coal mine. We have been crying out for decades that this is happening. And in fact, it was the Caribbean who championed the 1.5 to stay alive movement, which saw 1.5 being enshrined in the Paris Agreement. We need to acknowledge and really understand that climate impacts are happening now. This year is only April. We've had the warmest ever January. We had the hottest ever March. And I think it was if you look back to last year, it was a 10th record-breaking month in a row. In a row. Do you know what heat does to people? Heat has, I would say, the ability to uproot societies. And if you ever walk in Port of Spain at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you'll understand exactly what I'm saying.
No.
And I don't feel like the urgency is being translated to the people sitting inside in the negotiation rooms. Because we could keep talking and talking, and if nothing happens, people are just going to keep dying. They're going to keep losing their homes that they built with their blood, sweat, and tears. Where's the urgency? There is an opportunity coming up. So we're in April at the time of recording this podcast. In May, at the end of May, there will be the 4th SIDS conference in Antigua and Barbuda, which is our backyard. And I think that could be, maybe it won't have much impact in the scale of things, but it'll be a place where people from small islands can get together and declare that enough is enough. Because it's a conference for us. It's not a conference where small island representatives are being lost in the thousands. It's a conference for us. So maybe it might not have too much magnitude, but it's a good place to start. It's a good place for us to come together and agree on what really matters to us as small islands and where we need to go from here. And one more opportunity that just came to me. Last year, Vanuatu requested the International Court of Justice to provide an advisory opinion on the obligations of states with regard to climate change. As of the 22nd of March, that was the deadline for states to submit their written comments, and now the ICJ has to compile all of these and come up with their advisory opinion. That is a huge step for climate justice. And I'm positive that something good is going to come of that, because it's going to formally outline in legal language what states have to do. And I think that has the potential to really shape negotiations from there. But we need to wait and see what the advisory, when and what the advisory opinion is going to say. But I would encourage listeners to really look out for that.
Yeah, we shouldn't underestimate the power of seemingly small gatherings. Progress might seem long and slow, but we have to continue partnering, building alliances, advocating for ourselves. And also, thanks for highlighting 1.5 to stay alive, which for us is so much more than just a slogan.
It's a reality.
That 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold, which we are not on track globally to reach. It comes from the Paris Agreement, which was entered into in 2015. Just for everyone's benefit, the Paris Agreement is that the global community should come together and take action to limit global temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, and ideally to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Every degree of warming has significant impacts and repercussions on our natural ecosystems, our global climate systems, which translates into localized impacts. So the fact that we are not on track to achieve that 1.5 or even that 2-degree threshold, that highlights why we need to pay more attention to loss and damage, why we need to ensure that the fund is operationalized and is put to good use, and why we need to continue our advocacy, our activism, and all other forms of action to ensure that there is effective climate action and climate resilience building here in the Caribbean. So as we conclude today's episode, as I ask all my guests, I'd love to hear from you, your view on what would make the world a better place.
And this might sound a little bit sappy, but I think that our purpose in life is to help each other. And when you have societies that are built on only helping yourself, I think that's where things start to go south. I think we need to start looking outside of ourselves and start to help each other, not for any kind of anything in return, just because somebody needs help. And I think that reflects in our governments and our private sector as well. I've said this so many times, people, not profits. As much as I don't like people, people are important, and they don't deserve to be treated as expendable, like cogs in a machine, just to create profits. Because money rots and societies fall, but people never forget how you treated them. So that's my message. Help others. And be grateful, because life is short.
How can listeners connect with you and keep up with all your activities?
You can check out my Instagram, Zakour. You can search me on LinkedIn, and you can read the occasional articles that I put out on Global Voices and Climate Tracker.
And I'll be sure to add those links in the show notes so you can check out Christianne's writing on environmental matters, and you can also follow her on social media.
What I say here is from my experience and my personal education. I do not think that you all should be taking this at face value. I would encourage you to go and research it yourself. I have a bachelor's and a master's, but I don't think that you need to have tertiary education to be taking part in climate negotiations. You do not, because a lot of what I learned is available online. So just take the time, watch some YouTube videos, watch some YouTube lectures, take some free online courses. You don't need to read the whole textbook, but you should be actively educating yourself and questioning and asking why. And that is my closing message.
Thanks, Christianne, for joining us today on the Climate Conscious podcast. And I look forward to keeping up with your work in climate action and loss and damage.
Thank you for having me, Derval. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the Climate Conscious podcast. We hope you found today's episode interesting, informative, and inspiring. Visit theclimateconscious.com for more info. I'm Derval Bazi, and this is the Climate Conscious podcast.